What do you do when everything collapses? When prayers echo back in silence and the life you knew lies in ruins? For centuries, we've misunderstood Job, thinking it's just a story about suffering. But what if Job isn't about pain at all? What if it's about strength? A strength forged in the fire of loss. Stay with me, because this ancient book might just change how you see your storms forever. When the bottom falls out, think Job is about suffering? It's about strength in the storm. What if the hardest chapters of your life were not a curse, but a calling? The book of Job opens like a sunrise, warm and full of promise. Wealth, family, health, every blessing seems securely in place. But within a few verses, the light collapses into darkness. The richest man in the East becomes the poorest. The father of 10 buries them all in a single day. Health turns to agony, friends turn to accusations, and the question that has haunted humanity since Eden hangs heavy in the air. Why? For many, Job feels like the Bible's most unsettling book. It resists our craving for neat formulas and quick fixes. This isn't a story you can tie with a bow. Job doesn't give you a 3-step plan for avoiding pain. Instead, it walks you straight into the storm and dares you to stay there long enough to discover what lightning reveals in the dark. The honesty of this book is almost jarring. There are no polite prayers, no sanitized grief. Job curses the day he was born, rages against injustice, and even calls God to court. And yet, heaven does not silence him. The Spirit preserves every raw word as sacred scripture, reminding us that faith isn't the absence of questions. It's what keeps you speaking to God when the questions have no answers. But Job is more than a lament. It's a lens. Through its poetry and its pain, we see a truth that stretches far beyond one man's tragedy. That suffering is not evidence of God's absence, that unanswered prayers can still carry you into deeper presence, and that true strength is not found in avoiding the storm, but in enduring it without losing your soul. This is where Job will break you, by dismantling the illusion that faith guarantees comfort, that righteousness secures immunity from loss, that God's goodness is measured by your circumstances. And this is where Job will rebuild you, by revealing that the God who seems silent is still sovereign, that his purposes run deeper than the grave, and that the last word over your life will never belong to your wounds, but to his mercy. So as we step into this ancient ash heap, we aren't here to decode a puzzle or solve a riddle. We're here to listen, to wrestle, to discover that strength isn't forged in the absence of pain, but in the fire of it. Job isn't a story about avoiding the storm. It's a song about learning to stand in its fury and to whisper even then, "Though he slay me, yet will I trust him." The core of the storm. When God seems silent, is your faith still speaking? Job's story isn't about avoiding pain. It's about enduring when the answers don't come. At its heart, Job is not a book about suffering. It's a book about faith. Not the thin, transactional faith that thrives on blessings and crumbles when they're gone, but a faith with roots deep enough to survive the drought. And here lies the first great theme. Faith when God seems silent. From the opening chapter, Job is stripped bare. His wealth burns, his children perish, his health collapses. His cries rise toward heaven, but no answer falls. And yet, he keeps speaking. He refuses to turn silence into absence. Job doesn't stop praying because his prayers feel unheard. He doesn't stop believing because God feels distant. Instead, he turns his agony into dialogue. "Though he slay me, yet will I trust him." Job 13:15. This is not denial, it's defiance. A holy defiance that refuses to let go of God even when every reason says to. The second theme cuts just as deep, the danger of simplistic theology. Enter Job's friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, armed with the theology of cause and effect. To them, the equation is simple. Righteousness equals blessing, sin equals suffering. So if Job suffers, he must have sinned. Their words drip with certainty, but they wound like swords. This is what happens when we weaponize theology to protect our comfort instead of entering someone's pain. Job's story exposes this shallow thinking and calls us to something richer, a faith that embraces mystery instead of manufacturing answers. Then comes the thunderclap theme, that echoes through every chapter: God's sovereignty and the mystery of suffering. The book opens with a heavenly scene Job never sees, a cosmic dialogue where God allows Satan to test Job's integrity. And here's what unsettles us. Job suffers not because he was unrighteous, but because he was righteous. His suffering is not punishment. It's a platform, a stage on which the drama of faith unfolds before an unseen audience of heaven and hell. This is the paradox. What feels like chaos to Job is actually a contest revealing the weight of his worship. But Job also reminds us that sovereignty does not erase intimacy. God is not a distant tyrant pulling strings. He is a creator who answers out of the whirlwind, not to humiliate Job, but to reframe his vision. God doesn't give Job explanations, he gives him himself. Because at the deepest level, our hearts don't need reasons, they need relationship. Job's cry was never just, "Why?" It was, "Where are you?" And God's final response is not a philosophical argument, but a presence so overwhelming that Job says, "My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you." Job 42:5. And finally, there is a theme that threads through every lament, every argument, every verse etched in tears. Hope beyond the ash heap. Job, stripped of everything, still whispers a truth that has carried generations through the darkest nights. "I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end, he will stand on the earth." Job 19:25. Before the cross, before the empty tomb, Job saw a glimmer of resurrection. And that hope, faint but fierce, becomes the anchor that keeps him from drifting into despair. Job is not a book about getting answers. It's a book about finding something better. A faith that survives the furnace, a hope that outlives the grave, a God who may not explain himself but never abandons his own. These themes are not neat or easy, but they are true. And they are the only truths strong enough to hold when the storm comes for you. Symbols in the silence. Every image in Job whispers a truth too deep for words. Ashes, storms, and silence. Each one speaks if you dare to listen. Job's story isn't written in sterile prose. It bleeds poetry, rich with symbols that don't just describe, they interpret. To read Job well, you must learn to see the signposts embedded in its suffering. These are not random details. They are windows into the unseen. First, the ashes. When Job sits among the ashes scraping his wounds with broken pottery, Job 2 verse 8, it's not a casual detail, it's a living icon of surrender. In the ancient world, ashes signified mourning, humility, the acknowledgement that we are dust, and to dust we return. For Job, the ashes become his altar. Here, stripped of everything, he worships without the props of blessing. It's easy to raise hands when life is full. It's something else to bow in dust and still call him Lord. The ashes tell us that faith isn't proven in the palace, it's proven in the pit. Then comes the whirlwind. For 37 chapters, Job pleads for an answer. Heaven seems locked. And then suddenly the storm breaks, not with explanations, but with questions that roar like thunder. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Job chapter 38 verse 4. At first glance, God's response feels harsh, almost evasive, but the whirlwind is not a rebuke, it's a revelation. It reminds Job and us that suffering cannot be solved with syllogisms. It can only be reframed in the presence of the one who holds the cosmos in his hand. The storm that terrifies Job becomes the pulpit from which God preaches his glory. And here's the irony. The answer to Job's pain is not found in a sentence, but in a storm that shows him something bigger than pain: God himself. Consider also the courtroom imagery that runs through Job's speeches. Job longs for a mediator, an advocate who could stand between him and God, plead his case, and bridge the chasm. Even now my witness is in heaven. My advocate is on high. Job 16:19. This longing foreshadows the gospel in stunning clarity. Job aches for what Christ will become, the ultimate mediator who steps into our ashes and stands in our place. Job's cry for an advocate is the whisper of Calvary before the cross is raised. In his desperation, Job dreams of grace, and that dream is fulfilled in Jesus. And then there's the friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, who enter the story as comforters but end as cautionary tales. Their rigid theology symbolizes humanity's addiction to control. If suffering equals sin, then life is predictable, manageable. Their speeches drip with the idolatry of certainty, a counterfeit God that crumbles under the weight of real pain. Through them, Job warns us, beware of answers that come too quickly, of counsel that cloaks arrogance and piety. Sometimes the most faithful response is not explanation, but presence. The friends failed not because they spoke, but because they spoke too soon and too much. Even Job's restored fortunes at the end carry symbolic weight. The double portion is not a reward for good behavior, it's a prophetic picture of God's heart. That loss will not have the last word, that resurrection follows crucifixion, that in Christ, suffering is never wasted. The restoration of Job anticipates the renewal of all creation, when every tear will be wiped and every ash heap turned into an altar of glory. But perhaps the most haunting symbol of all is the silence, those long, echoing chapters where God says nothing. We read them with unease, but they are scripture too. The silence of God is not the absence of God, it's the classroom where faith learns to breathe. Silence strips us of formulas and forces us into raw dependence. It teaches us that trust is not built on clarity, but on covenant. Job's silence is the canvas on which hope paints its fiercest strokes. When you step back and see these symbols together, the ashes, the whirlwind, the courtroom, the silence, you realize Job is not a random tragedy. It is a gospel-shaped story, etched in suffering, a story that whispers through every image. Pain is real, but it is not ultimate. Questions remain, but so does God. The night is long, but the dawn is certain. Faith that breathes in the ashes. Job doesn't just tell a story, it teaches us how to live when life collapses. What do you do when the prayers go unanswered and the night refuses to break? If the book of Job were only a philosophical debate, it might satisfy the mind but leave the soul empty. But Job is more than poetry. It's a blueprint for faith in the crucible of suffering. His story demands that we ask not just why do bad things happen, but how do I live when they do? First, Job calls us to honest lament. Too often, modern faith has confused reverence with repression, as though real faith must silence the cry and paste on a smile. Job demolishes that illusion. He rips the veil off polite religiosity and teaches us that God is not threatened by our pain or offended by our questions. In fact, the very act of lament is an expression of faith. To complain to God is to believe He is listening. Job's raw honesty invites us to bring the full weight of our grief into God's presence, not because He owes us answers, but because He welcomes our hearts, even when they are breaking. Second, Job warns us against simplistic theology, the kind that turns suffering into a math problem and God into a vending machine. His friends represent a counterfeit comfort rooted in control. If suffering equals sin, then life makes sense. But real life refuses such neat equations, and when we cling to them, we become dangerous to others and blind to grace. Job challenges us to resist the temptation to explain away pain, and instead, embrace the mystery of God's purposes. Sometimes the most faithful thing we can say is nothing. Silence, presence, and tears often speak louder than words. If Job's friends had stayed quiet, they might have been heroes instead of warnings. Third, Job calls us to endurance in the unseen. For most of the story, Job has no idea why his life has imploded. He never learns about the heavenly dialogue that frames his suffering. His trial unfolds in the shadows of mystery, and so do ours. We rarely see the cosmic dimensions of our pain, but Job reminds us that our faith ripples into realms we cannot see. Your perseverance may be preaching a sermon to angels and demons alike. Your whispered prayer in the dark may echo louder in heaven than the most eloquent speech in daylight. When we endure without answers, we declare to a watching world and a watching heaven that God is worthy, not because He gives us everything we want, but because He is everything we need. Fourth, Job models hope anchored in God, not outcomes. His cry, "I know that my Redeemer lives," Job 19:25, is not wishful thinking. It's steel forged in fire. Job does not hope for restored wealth or health. He hopes in the living God who will one day vindicate him. That is the kind of hope that will carry you when the diagnosis comes back malignant, when the job offer never arrives, when the grave closes over someone you love. Hope that rests on circumstances will crumble. Hope that rests on God will hold when the earth gives way. And finally, Job invites us to become safe places for the broken. There is a quiet command hidden in this story. Don't be Eliphaz. Don't be Bildad. Don't be Zophar. When someone's world collapses, they don't need your explanations. They need your presence. Sit in the ashes with them. Hold their hand without hurrying their healing. Listen more than you speak. And if you must speak, let your words be seasoned with humility, not certainty. Job's friends tried to defend God and ended up misrepresenting him. Sometimes the most God-honoring thing we can do is weep with those who weep, and trust God to speak for himself in his time. In a world obsessed with quick fixes and easy answers, Job calls us to something slower, harder, and infinitely deeper. A faith that can breathe in the ashes, a hope that can bloom in the dark, a love that sits silently with the suffering and whispers, "You're not alone." Because Job's story is not just his, it's ours. And one day, like Job, we will see with our own eyes the God who never left us, the Redeemer who makes all things new. When the storm clears, Job doesn't end in ashes, it ends in awe. The God who seemed silent was writing something bigger all along. When the last chapter of Job turns, the man who once sat in dust and despair now rises in restoration. His wealth returns, his health is renewed, his family is restored. But if we think this is the moral of the story, hang on and you'll get double for your trouble. We've missed the point entirely. The true reward of Job's journey was never his possessions. It was the presence he encountered in the whirlwind. It was the voice that shattered the silence and revealed the author behind the anguish. Job began by asking why the loss, why the pain, why the silence. But when God speaks, Job doesn't get answers, he gets awe. He doesn't walk away with explanations, he walks away with an encounter. That's the turning point of this entire book, not the restoration of Job's fortunes, but the transformation of Job's faith. Listen to his confession. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Job 42:5. In other words, suffering didn't give Job clarity, it gave him intimacy. The God he once knew by hearsay he now knows by heart. This is the paradox at the center of Job, and at the center of every believer's story. God's silence is not his absence, and pain is not his punishment. Sometimes the very fire we beg God to quench is the fire he uses to purify our faith. Sometimes the storm we plead for him to stop is the very storm that blows the roof off our illusions and leaves us with what we needed all along, him. And if Job's story ended there, it would already be enough. But it doesn't. It whispers of something even greater. A Redeemer who steps into the ashes with us. Job longed for an advocate, someone who could bridge the gap between his dust and God's throne. That longing was a shadow cast by the cross. In Jesus, the cry of Job finds its answer. Here is the mediator Job dreamed of, the one who knows what it means to suffer without cause, to be pierced by pain that wasn't his own, to taste the silence of heaven and still say, "Not my will, but yours be done." On the cross, Jesus became the ultimate Job, innocent, yet afflicted, stripped of everything, yet holding fast to God, forsaken, yet faithful. And because he endured, our suffering is no longer meaningless. Our ashes are no longer the end. In his resurrection, he promises what Job glimpsed from afar. I know that my Redeemer lives. So what does this mean for you, here, now, in your own storm? It means your pain does not define you. Your loss does not write the last chapter. Your unanswered questions do not erase the presence of the one who walks with you in the dark. The God of Job is your God too, and he is still in the business of rebuilding what life has broken. Not always in the way we expect, not always on the timeline we demand, but always with a wisdom that stretches beyond the horizon of our sight. The call of Job is not to grit your teeth and wait for a double portion. It's to lean into the mystery with trust, to cling to the Redeemer who conquered the grave, to let the storm strip away every counterfeit security, until your faith rests on nothing and no one but him. And when it does, you will discover what Job discovered. that the greatest gift is not the restoration of what was lost, but the revelation of who God is. So maybe today, as you sit in your own ashes, you whisper Job's ancient confession and make it your own. Though he slay me, yet will I trust him. Because in the end, storms do not have the final word. Silence does not have the final word. Suffering does not have the final word. God does. And his word is life. His word is restoration. His word is hope. And when the storm clears, whether in this life or the next, you will not just hear of him. You will see him. And that sight will make every shadow worth enduring.